I recently upgraded the extruder on my 3D printer. Now, this was the original configuration of my 3D printer, but for quite a while I have been using it without the display at the very top next to the spool of filament. I took that off and I centered the spool. All of the functions that you can perform on that panel can be performed through the print software, and I just find it much quicker and much more convenient to use the print software to perform all of those functions. So it really hasn't looked like that in a while, but other than removing the panel and centering the spool of filament, it was the same. This is the original extruder assembly, and it worked fine, but what I didn't like about it was that it's very heavy. It has this big steel stepper motor. This white spacer is actually the stepper motor gear and idler wheel that force the filament down into the hothead. And finally, you have the hothead, cooling fan motor, and heatsink. So of course the first thing I did was take it all apart. And with a real can-do attitude, I took off this custom bracket that I don't know if you could find one to replace it, but anyway, if you look closely, you'll see scribed layout lines. Did a most excellent hack job on my bandsaw. 3D printers are actually called additive manufacturing tools. This is old school subtractive manufacturing, which is exactly what I did. I cleaned it up on my mini mill. That should do it. I pulled some aluminum out of the scrap pile and I machined these two parts. The top part is I'm only going to use a portion of that, but I cleaned it up on both surfaces, and then the bottom piece I'm going to use that whole piece of aluminum with a few more steps. I actually got a little tricky on this piece and cut a little step into the block for alignment, which I'll point out to you. Here's a test fit with the little step hanging over the back of the bracket, just to line everything up quickly. Everything looked good, so I drilled and tapped it for 2 screws. I cut off the portion of this that I was going to use, and I milled in 2 recesses for 2 more screw mounts. I drilled and tapped 2 more screw holes in the top of the block. Test fit everything, and it went together well. Once I saw that everything fit together properly, I drilled some holes to lighten the mounting block. Weight is why I'm doing one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why I'm doing all this. This is a test fit. So far, so good. Another angle. The printhead assembly and the mounting block and boom that I made, that the arrow's pointing to, replaces those 3 parts in the foreground. I estimate, without having weighed everything, but just by looking at that big heavy steel motor with the number 2 on it, I estimate I probably saved at least 50% in weight, probably more like 65. The 2 main advantages for doing this are faster print speeds and less wear on the they call it a printhead gantry. This is the new filament driver that will replace what looked like the white spacer in the old assembly. It's very similar. The stepper motor gear that you can see in the previous picture goes through that hole in the very center and rests up against that idler wheel. And that spring keeps the idler wheel up against the gear, and it feeds the filament through that funnel at the top. This is the full filament driver assembly. If you look between the motor and the red part, you can barely see a thin black spacer, but it's actually the vertical portion of the mounting bracket that the motor's sitting on. Okay, this is the head replacement complete, and I've got everything assembled, and I've got the wires all harnessed pretty well. And you can see where the arrow is pointing to that heavy stepper motor and filament driver assembly, and it gets it off of the moving printhead, which is a huge advantage. It's called a Bowden head. Another look from a different angle. And one last look. I also took the opportunity to replace that belt that the arrow's pointing to. I didn't have any indication that it was a problem, but I was in there. It was very accessible, so I just took advantage of the opportunity to do it, because it would be a real pain in the neck at another time when the head was all assembled. I know what you're thinking. Okay, it looks pretty, but does it work? Of course it works. So I've just got it pumping out hot filament now. I still need to dial it in. It needs a lot of work on the settings, but as you can see, the upgrade was successful, and I've got it working.
Does it not? It sounds like old Zeke Emmanuel here is kind of making my point. 2.5%, mainly old people with complicated, it's a respiratory thing. Same thing they say.